It is what it is. I am what I am. I put California Boomer out there like an unknown fringe artist puts out a painting. That sentence summarizes for me my 5-year project. Very much like people devote their lives to their children to go on with their culture and genes, I'm leaving my culture, California Boomer. It is what it is, I am what I am part covers my what I call quirkiness, the quirks and my spontaneous thoughts, graphics, notes, video clips. One of the things about this YouTube memoir is that you can go to californiaboomer.com, the webpage, and on that webpage are over 400 links to the topics that I cover in California Boomer. And each one of those topics has a link to that part of the YouTube video that'll go directly there. And so you don't have to sit and watch the entire California Boomer if you'd rather just browse down through those links, or if there's a certain subject you're interested in, such as cats, say. You can do a search in page for cat, and up will come a 10-second video clip of my cat and my dog wrestling. And so you can do this for any subject, such as Mexico or Africa or Malawi. Another thing that I do in California Boomer is I put up what I call graphical narrative to go along with, or sometimes completely different from, my audio narrative. Most often, the graphical narrative supports and sort of fleshes out my audio narrative, but in a number of other cases, I put up a completely unrelated graphical narrative. In other words, photos supporting graphics such as a screenshot of a Wikipedia page or of a New York Times article, because people generally have the capacity to process at least two media dimensions. And so you can listen to one and look at the other. And then when you want to focus on one, you can pause it and look at the graphical narrative, such as my text. And sometimes there's more than two. So I call this multiple track narration. Well, now I don't play music during my narration unless I'm talking about specific music, such as Middle Eastern music. I'll play some of my favorite Middle Eastern music in the background, especially if it's easy to listen to, which is the case with Middle Eastern music, which I love. And so in that case, there are at least 3 tracks. There's graphical, there's musical audio, and then there's my narrative audio. And if you count the text notations that I put, stories that I tell sometimes that are next to the photos or other graphics that I put up, you could consider that a 4th track. So you'd have my audio narrative, you'd have the audio music, you'd have graphical, and you'd have photos, and then you have the text things. And what this does is it allows me to get stories and anecdotes and experiences in without making California Boomer any longer than it already is. And so it's a way to get interesting or relevant material into my memoir without going on for too many hours. So these graphical narratives add to the dimensionality of California Boomer and of a memoir, which traditionally has been a book with perhaps a few illustrations and photos. And the added dimensions are, I believe, what people need these days to stay engaged. And so for those who want to do this kind of thing, I will have in the annex a chapter on the making of California Boomer, because some of the things that I did, such as getting the links from YouTube and putting them onto the California Boomer webpage, are not at all straightforward as of 2024 anyway. So this 5-year project is a big part of my life. Well, I'm 72 years old, and about 10 years ago, I started feel a loss of power. Anyway, long story short, a deterioration of my spinal cord that's very briefly in the last chapter. I've been what I call barca-lounged by this rare spinal cord disorder that none of the doctors have ever heard of, the foie à la Jouanine syndrome. And so at this point in 2024, I can spend about 60 minutes a day on my feet. At the beginning of the year, it was 120 minutes. I'm halfway through 2024 and it's about 60 minutes a day. And that is interspersed with 12 waking hours. This is not my bed hours, 12 waking hours in the Barca Lounger from morning and right through evening. And so essentially I'm 72 years old going on 92 physically, because I see what my dad was like when he was 92 and other people, and very much like that. But I'm 72 going on 42 mentally, and that's why I'm doing all of this programming to create this YouTube memoir. And I'm resisting with all my power going to wheelchair. So my closest companion, of course, is the 75-inch smart TV, 10 feet in front of me, connected to a laptop, and I do all my work on that. And then in the evening when I'm all burned out from doing work, I watch my movies and Netflix and stuff. And I did do a 2-minute video on how people can set that up, because I just see way too many people hunched over laptops at these workstations watching YouTube videos. And then other companions, Coco the dog and Barry the cat. Barry is in Strawberry. The cat are my other companions. So starting with chapter 0, I actually did chapter 1, and then I said, I really need to do a whole chapter on the ancestors. So I called it chapter 0 because most of it is before I was born, although it's named The Ancestors and My California Culture. And so I do include current stuff. But right from the first seconds, you get my quirky approach to things, in which I record my morning prayer that precedes my first meditation of the day. And it's not religious. Okay? I'm Unitarian. I talk about that a number of times throughout California Boomer. And what I say right away after I finish the prayer is that this replaces the prayers of my ancestors to their god or gods or goddesses. So I talk about how we had 1,000 years of Christian. My ancestry is all Northern Europe. And Christianity, I thought, came 2,000 years ago, but it really was more like 1,000 years ago. And before that, what were they doing? They were praying to their gods and goddesses. And so I talk about the power of the human mind that really was the foundation for that faith and the power of their gods and goddesses. So it's the power of the human mind that my Christian ancestors, including one grandmother, Grandma Gladys Vernon Lauder, she was the last of the devout Christians of my immediate family. And so I show some screenshot of articles from Science News about how in that faith we are invoking what I believe is the power of the human mind when they invoke that faith in God. And then in that ancestry chapter, I take on a subject that was difficult. I had to think about it, and I wrapped my head around the subject of having the enslavement of Black people in my direct ancestry. In other words, a great-great-grandfather and triple great-grandparents. And that wasn't easy, but I do show the evidence for that. So that was difficult, and I talk about how I reject the culture of that line. But we all have 16 great-great-grandparents, and at least 2 of those grandparents of mine were from Vermont. And Vermont was the state that sent more men per capita to fight for the Union side and die in the hundreds of thousands to end slavery. And so that's important, because that perspective of having those 2 different sides, and ironically and interestingly, it was the Vermont great-grandmother who married the son of the slave owners. But when he moved to Oakland, he took on the California culture, which is very important to me, because he completely left behind that old culture of the Confederacy, of enslavement, and married this woman who was from Vermont, a staunch abolitionist, abolition of slavery. And so this diffuse nature of all ancestry is an important perspective, because so many people focus on only one famous grandparent, when in actuality we have 32 triple great grandparents and 64 quadruple great grandparents, one of whom in my Vernon line, the quadruple great grandfather, was Thomas Gaines Vernon, who, along with his brother Richard Vernon, served throughout the Revolutionary War and is on the official Valley Forge muster roll. And I had to send them the records that showed that. I brought up the old Revolutionary War records as well as Civil War Confederate for each soldier. So this Revolutionary War hero, Tom Vernon, he later enslaved black people. That's the terminology we use. And yet his son was an officer in the War of 1812. Miles Hicks Vernon served under Andrew Jackson in Jackson's victory over the British at New Orleans. And then it was his son, Anderson Perry Vernon, who was in the Southern Cavalry, and he later was one of 32,000 Confederate troops who surrendered to the Union troops at Vicksburg after Grant's brilliant encirclement starved out the Confederates, the Rebs, as I say. And this was what Grandma Vernon Lauder used to tell me. She always used that terminology when Grant starved out the Confederates at Vicksburg. So while I reject the entire culture of that part of my ancestry, I nevertheless keep that line of ancestry, being in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812. So I hold on to that Vernon line, and because Grandma Vernon Lauder was a stalwart of the family. She was amazing. She had strength. So I can't reject that line completely. In ancestry, I go on to a grandfather who was a major player, a manager in the Manhattan Project in 1944 and 45, in which the atom bomb was developed. And he knew Robert Oppenheimer. And I remember when I was young that Grandpa Louis used to make jokes about Oppie, about him being liberal, quote, commie, because Oppenheimer was liberal and Grandpa Louis was a staunch conservative. That Ancestors chapter was one that I'm really proud of, and it wasn't until chapter 11, just recently finished, that I'm also proud of that one. The others in between, they have a lot of material that I believe is important and noteworthy. The chapters on the in the mid 70s, late 70s, and into the 80s, when I was an undergraduate and then in graduate school, a lot of those narratives are accompanied with what I call experimental graphics. You can laugh at this. I saved door notes. Hey, what are file cabinets for? I saved the notes from that were left on my door, hundreds of them. And I put some of those in. There are pages from my dream journal, because back then we were doing dream workshops, and these Jungian psychologists and people interested in psychology of Carl Jung. And in one of the chapters later, I was in Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, I went to visit the dream people in the forested mountains in the interior of Malaysia. They were the Sonoy people, well known for making dreams central to their society. A number of the pages of my journals and letters home are quite personal and revealing, but I put those in because I wanted people, especially young people in the future, to see what was going through the head of this boomer. I want people to see that if they're going through difficulties and having certain thoughts, they can maybe remember back to watching this California boomer. So I kept those in, and I also have letters home as well as letters from home, and things like a letter from my mom in which she mentions Mike got a job as a ranch hand up in Modoc County. And so my letters home pretty much tell the story of my trips, although I did leave the scary stuff out because I didn't want to upset my mom and dad. And then in a number of the chapters, starting with chapter 0 and going all the way to chapter 11, and then chapter 12, which I haven't done yet, I bring Jesus in as an important part of my culture in a non-religious way. Because so much of what my home state, California, is doing is bringing people in from what would be considered outside the fold into society. So, for instance, I show a screenshot of an article from 2024 in my local Davis newspaper that says that California will include the undocumented people in the Medi-Cal healthcare. And this is a really important part of my California culture, this sort of California-grown, non-religious inclusion of outsiders, whether it's gender orientation or undocumented immigrants. This inclusiveness is one of the major things that we have inherited from Jesus in a non-religious way. And I'm proud of my state doing that. And I want my tax money to go to that kind of support for the people who are the most vulnerable in our society. So moving on to other parts of California Boomer, there are a number of things that I relate about developing the first environmental software and developing a course on the history of Western consciousness in the experimental college at UC Davis. And then I talk about my teaching. And I think it's really important for people who are interested in education and who are teachers. I talk about my time on the faculty at Imperial Valley College in the California desert. And long story short, I was dismissed wrongly by a right-wing cabal that happened to rule things back then in that far corner of California. And then I talk about much later how teaching university biology with Zoom during the pandemic, it actually improved my teaching, which is almost an unknown occurrence. I explain how my course actually improved. I tossed out exams because they can't be done well online. And then I explored the Canvas learning management system and used what they called New Quiz, which is a new system in which short answer written questions are auto-graded by the now archaic artificial intelligence that it used. And so I was able to come up with 2 quizzes per lecture, one at the beginning, one at the end. And the students thought they were easy, which I think they were, but they learned more than in the old system of exams that stressed them so badly. Because when you're relaxed, you learn more. I was able to come up with these 2 quizzes in about 15 minutes before each lecture, which what every teacher needs to hear is that this whole thing only took me about 20 minutes, mainly because of the auto grading. This vastly improved 2 goals of the California University system: equitability and student engagement. I think it's important for any teachers to watch that. So moving on, I also talk about my PhD work on wine, on the soil ecology of vineyards, but I talk about wine and wine quality because, as any wine enthusiast knows, the nature of the soil, the terroir, is important in the wine quality, and I talk about that in the context of organically managed vineyards and what is known as biodynamic farming of vineyards. And so I have a funny anecdote in there about the pickup truck driving farm managers who took over vineyards that were bought by wealthy people and who said, "We want this managed biodynamically." I also, in chapter 11, use Professor Dumbledore from Harry Potter to introduce my work on food security. I also reflect on Islam because a third of my students were Muslim, as well as about a third of the population of Tanzania. And so I give some perspectives that you don't hear very much. I also talk about teaching worldviews to about 500 Tanzanian students at St. John's University, and it was fun introducing them to Latin American liberation theology, which they had never even heard of. And I had worked in Guatemala, and I talked in chapter 5, I think, about Father Ron Burke, who was a priest who was part of liberation theology and who made the list of the death squads. But the funnest part of worldviews was teaching quantum physics and quantum consciousness, the consciousness that came out of quantum physics, in which there are 10 dimensions. And so I showed them a video that BBC made entitled "Who Lives in the 11th Dimension?" And it blew their minds because they'd all been raised religiously. And all of these audio narratives are accompanied by graphics So I guess you can see that teaching has been my passion, because there are dozens and dozens of other worthy, I think, notable and entertaining things that I cover in 12 chapters of California Boomer. Connecting with science is another thing that I think is important. One of those is in chapter 11 on Africa, showing the science of the genomes of African people being vastly more diverse, to the point that Africans have certain gene complexes which are known as private alleles. In other words, they only exist in Africans. And so I reflect on the importance of this, that there may be some mode of the mind different from all of the others from around the world. And I talk about how we can help the Africans allow these people to rise through society and contribute. And this, I think, gives a whole new perspective on Africa and the Africans. And then I talk about culture and genes, and how, for me, culture is what I am leaving to the world. California Boomer. I don't have children. And I show a book from my former professor, Pete Richardson, who basically wrote the book on how culture is so important along with genes in humanity. And then just to list a few examples from my memoir that I think are interesting. I was living in Jerusalem during the 1972 Munich Olympics when the massacre of Israeli athletes by Palestinian terrorists occurred, and I relate an anecdote about the tension that I experienced in an office on that day when there was both a Palestinian officewoman and a Jewish Israeli owner were present. Also, then I talk about surviving the driving of my camper, the Dolphin, partway through Mexico City, and then having to abort that trip and just drive straight east out of Mexico City to get away from the frighteningly aggressive and corrupt police. And then I tell a laugh out loud story, what I call the wet dream story, about being in a hotel room in Las Vegas, bringing a mixed group of UC Davis students from backpacking in the Grand Canyon. And all 9 of us slept in one room, sleeping bags and stuff. So while this isn't a comprehensive review, there are many, many more anecdotes. What I wanted to do here is just give examples of my memoir.